What happens when one of a television's most respected creators sits down for what should be a routine late-night interview, only to discover the host has a completely different agenda? What you're about to hear is the shocking account of how a simple, promotional appearance turned into one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. This is the story of how Seth MacFarlane, the creative genius behind Family Guy, American Dad, and The Orville, found himself in a heated battle of wits with Jimmy Kimmel that ended with security being called and a guest being physically escorted from the studio. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think really went down that night. It was supposed to be a typical Tuesday night taping of Jimmy Kimmel Live. Seth MacFarlane had been booked to promote his latest project, and everything seemed routine during the pre-show preparations. The audience was buzzing with excitement, the cameras were rolling, and Jimmy Kimmel took his position behind the desk with his trademark smirk. But what started as standard Hollywood promotion quickly devolved into something nobody in that studio could have predicted. Seth walked out to thunderous applause, his usual confident demeanor intact, as he waved to the crowd and took his seat in the guest chair. The opening pleasantries seemed normal enough. Jimmy welcomed him with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm, thanking him for coming on the show and asking about his recent projects. Seth, ever the professional, launched into his prepared talking points about his work, his passion for storytelling, and his gratitude for his loyal fan base. But then something shifted in Jimmy's tone. Instead of following the typical late-night formula of light-hearted banter and promotional segments, Jimmy began steering the conversation in an increasingly uncomfortable direction. His questions became more pointed, more personal, and carried an undercurrent of hostility that Seth initially tried to brush off as edgy comedy. "You know, Seth," Jimmy said, leaning back in his chair with a calculated smile, "I've always wondered about successful people like you. Do you ever feel like maybe you've had it too easy? Like maybe some of your success came from being in the right place at the right time, rather than pure talent?" The audience laughed nervously, unsure if this was part of a planned bit or something more serious. Seth maintained his composure, chuckling politely and deflecting with humor. "Well, Jimmy, I think anyone who's worked in this industry knows that success requires a combination of preparation, opportunity, and probably a little bit of luck. I've been fortunate, but I've also worked incredibly hard to get where I am." Jimmy's yes expression didn't soften. If anything, his smile became more predatory. "That's interesting because I've heard some people in the industry say that your type of humor is becoming outdated, that maybe the world has moved past the kind of content you create. How does it feel to know that younger creators are doing what you do, but better?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. This wasn't playful ribbing between colleagues. This was a direct attack disguised as an interview question. Seth's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his professional facade. "I think comedy is subjective, Jimmy. What resonates with one person might not work for another, and that's the beauty of creative expression. There's room for all kinds of voices in entertainment." "But is there really?" Jimmy pressed, his voice taking on a more aggressive edge. "I mean, let's be honest here. Your shows have been criticized for their content. Some people say they're offensive, that they promote negative stereotypes. Don't you think as a creator you have a responsibility to do better?" The studio audience had gone completely silent. Even the band members were exchanging uncomfortable glances. This wasn't the Jimmy Kimmel they knew, the affable host who specialized in celebrity pranks and viral videos. This was someone with an agenda, someone who seemed determined to tear down his guest on live television. Seth straightened in his chair, his diplomatic mask beginning to slip. "I think any creator who's been in this business as long as I have has evolved their perspective over time. I'm proud of the work I've done, and I stand behind the stories I've told. If someone doesn't enjoy my content, they're free to watch something else." "That's a pretty convenient answer," Jimmy shot back, his voice dripping with condescension. "But don't you think that's exactly the problem with people in your position? You create content that some people find harmful, and when called out on it, you just say, 'Change the channel.' Isn't that kind of irresponsible?" The tension in the studio was palpable now. Crew members were whispering to each other, and the show's producers could be seen frantically gesturing from the wings. This was clearly going off script in a way that nobody had anticipated. Seth's publicist, sitting in the green area behind the cameras, looked like she was ready to leap onto the stage and drag her client to safety. Seth took a deep breath, his years of media training kicking in as he tried to de-escalate the situation. "Jimmy, I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here, but I came on your show to talk about my work, not to defend my entire career against what feels like a coordinated attack. If you have specific concerns about something I've created, I'm happy to have that conversation, but this feels unnecessarily hostile." Jimmy leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Hostile? I'm just asking questions that I think your fans deserve answers to. Isn't that what journalism is supposed to be about? Or do you only want to do interviews where everyone just tells you how wonderful you are?" "This isn't journalism," Seth replied, his voice getting stronger and more assertive. "This is ambush television, and frankly, it's beneath both of us. I agreed to come here as a professional courtesy, to promote my work and have a conversation with someone I thought was a colleague. Instead, you're treating me like I'm some kind of criminal who needs to be interrogated." The audience was completely silent now, watching this unprecedented confrontation unfold in real time. Jimmy's smile had turned into something more like a sneer, and it was becoming clear that this wasn't some elaborate prank or comedy bit gone wrong. This was a genuine conflict between two powerful figures in entertainment, playing out for millions of viewers. "A colleague," Jimmy repeated, mockingly. "That's interesting, because I've never considered someone who makes the kind of content you make to be a true colleague. Real entertainers, real artists, they care about the impact of their work. They care. Don't just throw offensive material at the wall and see what sticks." That was the moment when Seth MacFarlane's legendary composure finally began to crack. His eyes flashed with genuine anger, and for the first time since the interview began, he looked like he might actually walk off the set. The fire in Seth's eyes was unmistakable now. What had started as professional irritation was rapidly transforming into something much more dangerous. He shifted forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a lower, more controlled register that anyone familiar with his work would recognize as a warning sign. "Jimmy, I'm going to give you one opportunity to explain what this is really about," Seth said, his words measured and deliberate. "Because this isn't about my work, this isn't about journalism, and this certainly isn't about entertainment. This is personal, and I want to know why." Jimmy's response was to lean back in his chair with an expression of mock innocence. "Personal? Seth, I think you're being a little paranoid here. I'm just doing my job, asking the hard questions that other interviewers are too afraid to ask. Isn't that what good television is supposed to be? Good television?" Seth's voice rose slightly, his legendary calm finally beginning to fracture. "Good television is honest, it's entertaining, it's respectful. What you're doing right now is none of those things. You're grandstanding, you're being deliberately provocative, and you're doing it at my expense for what? Ratings." The studio audience was now completely transfixed by this real-time meltdown. Some people were pulling out their phones, trying to capture what was clearly going to become a viral moment. The show's producers were in full panic mode, making frantic hand gestures to try to get Jimmy to change course, but he seemed completely oblivious to their concerns. "At your expense?" Jimmy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Seth, you've made millions of dollars creating content that many people find offensive. You've built an empire on jokes that punch down at marginalized communities, and now you're upset because someone is finally calling you out on it. That seems pretty hypocritical to me. Seth stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward with the force of his movement. The sudden action caused a ripple of gasps from the audience, and several security guards who had been stationed around the studio began moving closer to the stage. Hypocritical? Seth's voice was now carrying clearly throughout the studio without his microphone. You want to talk about hypocrisy? Let's talk about a late-night host who built his career on making fun of celebrities, politicians, and ordinary people, suddenly deciding he's some kind of moral authority. Let's talk about someone who's made countless jokes that could be considered offensive, but somehow thinks he has the right to sit in judgment of other people's work. Jimmy's composure was starting to slip as well. His carefully constructed television persona was cracking, revealing something uglier underneath. That's completely different, and you know it. My comedy punches up, not down. I go after people in power, not vulnerable communities. Really? Seth shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Because I seem to remember plenty of segments where you've mocked ordinary people, made fun of their appearances, their accents, their circumstances. But I suppose that's different because it's your show, right? Your rules, your standards. The confrontation was spiraling completely out of control. Now, what had started as an uncomfortable interview had devolved into a full-scale argument between two entertainment industry heavyweights, with neither one backing down. The studio audience was watching in stunned silence, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Jimmy jumped to his feet as well, his mask of television friendliness completely abandoned. You know what the difference is, Seth. I own my mistakes. When I cross a line, I acknowledge it, and I try to do better. But you just hide behind the excuse that it's all comedy, that people should lighten up. You never take responsibility. For anything. Take responsibility? Seth's laugh was harsh and bitter. I've taken responsibility for every single thing I've ever created. I've stood behind my work, I've defended my choices, and I've never once tried to throw anyone under the bus to save my own reputation. Can you say the same? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jimmy's face was flushed now, his carefully styled hair slightly disheveled from his animated gestures. It was clear that this confrontation had moved far beyond anything either of them had planned or expected. "How dare you?" Jimmy said, his voice shaking with rage. "How dare you come onto my show, in my studio, and question my integrity? You don't know anything about the pressures I face, the decisions I have to make, the compromises I have to live with." Compromises? Seth seized on the word like a weapon. Is that what this is about? Did someone tell you to do this? Did someone suggest that taking me down would be good for your image, good for your ratings, good for your career? The accusation hit like a physical blow. Jimmy's eyes widened slightly, and for just a moment, his expression revealed something that looked almost like guilt. But he recovered quickly, his anger flaring even brighter. "Nobody tells me what to do on my own show," he snarled. "This is my decision, my choice to finally call out someone who's been hiding behind the comedy defense for way too long." "Your choice?" Seth stepped closer to Jimmy's desk, his presence imposing and intimidating. "Your choice to ambush a guest who came here in good faith. Your choice to turn what should have been a professional interview into a public execution. Your choice to use your platform to settle whatever personal grudge you're carrying." Jimmy stood his ground, but it was clear that Seth's physical presence was having an effect. The creator of Family Guy might be known for his humor, but he was also a tall, imposing figure when he wanted to be, and right now he looked like someone who was done playing games. "Personal grudge?" Jimmy's voice cracked slightly. "This isn't personal, this is professional. This is about standards, about accountability, about doing the right thing in an industry that's too often willing to look the other way. Standards? Seth's voice rose to a level that could be heard clearly throughout the entire studio. You want to talk about standards? Let's talk about the standard of treating your guests with basic respect. Let's talk about the standard of honest journalism versus gotcha television. Let's talk about the standard of being a decent human being instead of a ratings-hungry vulture. The insult landed like a slap. Jimmy's face went white, then red, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras was audible, everyone holding their breath as they waited to see what would happen next. "Get out," Jimmy said, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my studio right now," Seth smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Gladly. But first, let me tell your audience something that you clearly don't want them to know." He turned toward the cameras, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years commanding attention. "What you just witnessed wasn't journalism, it wasn't entertainment, and it certainly wasn't professional. What you witnessed was someone using their platform to settle a personal score, and doing it in the most cowardly way possible. Security!" Jimmy shouted, his voice echoing through the studio. "Get him out of here now!" The moment Jimmy shouted for security, the entire studio erupted into chaos. Two large security guards began moving toward the stage, but Seth held his ground, his eyes locked on Jimmy with an intensity that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. He wasn't finished yet, and everyone could sense it. "Before your security throws me out," Seth said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Let me ask you one more question, Jimmy. How much did they pay you to do this?" The question stopped everyone cold. The security guards hesitated, the audience gasped, and Jimmy's face went through a series of expressions that told a story all their own. First confusion, then panic, then a rage so pure and undiluted that it transformed his entire appearance. "What did you just say to me?" Jimmy's voice was barely controlled, shaking with fury. Seth stepped even closer to the desk, his presence dominating the space. "You heard me. This whole performance, this orchestrated attack, someone put you up to this. The question is who, and how much was your integrity worth?" "You're insane," Jimmy sputtered. But his denial lacked conviction. "Nobody paid me to do anything. This is my show, my questions, my choice." "Is it?" Seth's smile was cold and calculating. "Because from where I'm standing, this looks like someone who's been given very specific talking points, very specific attacks to make. This wasn't spontaneous, Jimmy. This was planned, scripted, and paid for." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Jimmy's hands were shaking now, whether from rage or something else. It was impossible to tell. The studio audience was completely silent, transfixed by this unprecedented confrontation. "Get him out of here," Jimmy said again, but his voice lacked the authority it had held moments before. "I don't have to listen to these conspiracy theories," Seth laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Conspiracy theories? Jimmy, I've been in this business long enough to recognize a hit job when I see one. The question is whether your audience is smart enough to see it too." He turned back to the cameras, his voice taking on the commanding presence that had made him one of the television's most successful creators. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing right now is exactly what's wrong with our industry. You're watching someone use their platform not to entertain, not to inform, but to destroy. And the saddest part is, he's doing it for money." "That's enough!" Jimmy exploded, his carefully constructed television persona completely shattered. "I don't care who you think you are. I don't care how successful you think you are. You don't get to come into my studio and make these accusations." "Then prove me wrong," Seth challenged, his voice steady and unwavering. Tell your audience why you really invited me here tonight. Tell them who suggested this line of questioning. Tell them what you hope to accomplish by turning this interview into an ambush. Jimmy's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The silence stretched on, becoming more damaging with each passing second. Finally, he managed to speak, but his voice was weak and unconvincing. I don't have to prove anything to you. This is my show, and I can ask whatever questions I want. Of course you can, Seth agreed. But your audience deserves to know when. Those questions are being asked in good faith, and when they're being asked because someone with deep pockets wanted to see me humiliated on television. The security guards were finally close enough to intervene, but they seemed hesitant to actually lay hands on Seth. This wasn't some random troublemaker, this was a major figure in the entertainment industry, and forcibly removing him from the studio would create its own set of problems. Sir, we need you to leave, one of the guards said, his voice respectful but firm. Seth nodded, his point made. I'll leave. But first, let me say one more thing to the people watching at home. He looked directly into the camera, his expression serious and sincere. Don't let anyone tell you that asking questions makes you a troublemaker. Don't let anyone convince you that demanding honesty makes you a conspiracy theorist. And don't let anyone use their platform to silence voices they disagree with. Are you finished? Jimmy asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But underneath it, there was something that sounded almost like desperation. Almost, Seth replied. I just want to thank you, Jimmy, for showing everyone exactly who you really are tonight. You've done more to damage your own credibility in the last 20 minutes than I ever could have. With that, Seth turned and began walking toward the exit, the security guards flanking him, but not actually touching him. The studio audience watched in stunned silence as one of television's most successful creators made his way off the stage, his dignity intact despite the circumstances. But Jimmy wasn't finished. As Seth reached the edge of the stage, the host's voice rang out across the studio, filled with venom and desperation. Run away, Seth! That's what you always do when someone challenges you. You hide behind your success, behind your money, behind your lawyers. Seth stopped and turned back, his expression almost pitying. Jimmy, the only person running away here is you. Running away from the truth. Running away from accountability. Running away from the fact that you sold your soul tonight for 30 pieces of silver. The biblical reference wasn't lost on anyone in the studio. The comparison to Judas was deliberate and devastating, and Jimmy's face went white with rage and something that looked almost like shame. Get out, Jimmy screamed, his voice cracking with emotion. Get out and don't ever come back. Seth smiled one last time, the expression that was equal parts sad and triumphant. Don't worry, Jimmy. I wouldn't dream of it. As Seth disappeared into the wings, escorted by security but walking under his own power, the studio fell into an uncomfortable silence. Jimmy stood behind his desk, his chest heaving, his hair disheveled, his carefully constructed image in ruins. The audience didn't know whether to applaud, boo, or simply sit in stunned silence. Finally, Jimmy seemed to remember that he was on live television. He straightened his tie, tried to smooth his hair, and attempted to regain some semblance of his professional composure. But the damage was done, and everyone in that studio knew it. Well, he said, his voice still shaky. That was certainly unexpected. We'll be right back after these messages. As the cameras cut away and the studio lights dimmed, the full impact of what had just happened began to sink in. This wasn't just a heated interview gone wrong. This was a complete meltdown. Broadcast live to millions of viewers, Jimmy Kimmel had just destroyed his own reputation in pursuit of destroying someone else's, and the whole world had watched it happen. The question now was whether the entertainment industry would ever forget what they had witnessed, and whether Jimmy Kimmel's career could survive the fallout from his own actions. One thing was certain. This was a night that would be talked about for years to come, and not in a way that Jimmy would ever want to remember. So what do you think really happened behind the scenes that night? Was Seth right about Jimmy being paid to conduct that ambush interview? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more shocking stories from the world of entertainment. Security! Jimmy shouted, his voice echoing through the studio. Get him out of here now!